I'm Dr. Lynn Glickman, the superintendent here in CCSD 46. Earlier this school year, we determined that we needed to have an in-depth review and discussion of our facilities as they relate to educational delivery and capacity. So over the past months, our architect firm, Wold Architects and Engineers, has been walking our schools and meeting with our district staff to gather data and information about our facilities. Tonight, they're here to deliver their findings to our community. Wold partner Von Dirks has much to share with you, and I don't want to steal any of his time. However, before I introduce you to Von, I do want to review our CCSD 46 mission with all of you, as we do at the start of any presentation. So we'd like our next slide. There we go. I'll note that discussing our facilities speaks to all three arms of our mission statement. As learners who enjoy impactful learning environments are indeed empowered learners. And we want our students to have what they need, which speaks to equity. And our facilities are used by our entire community. Thus, we are cultivating community. And of course, we have our facilities goal, which came out of our strategic planning process. I'm not going to read that to you, but you can see that it is this goal which brought us to this educational adequacy facilities assessment. And now I am very pleased to introduce you to Mr. Von Dirks from Wold Architects and Engineers.
Thank you, Lynn. We've got a lot of information to cover tonight, everybody. I'll start with introductions of myself. My name is Von Dirks. I'm with Wold Architects and Engineers. And we're going to spend the rest of the night going over our overview of process, presenting the information, and at the end we'll have a little bit of a chance for questions. As I said, there's a lot of information here, and I don't intend for everybody to digest it all tonight. This presentation, a recording of it, the PDF of the presentation, as well as the report will be available on the website, so you can review that starting tomorrow. The rest of my team that's been working with us on this, Mike Eichhorn, Dan Critta, Maggie Crane, all part of our offices here. In terms of who we are a national firm that's been in business since 1968. We focus primarily on public sector work, with a lot of work in the public education realm. We have offices in Minnesota, Illinois, Colorado, and Tennessee, and about 300 people across all of our offices. We also have architects, engineers, interior designers, and master planners like myself as part of our office to help us with this overview. As I said, we're going to talk about a lot of different things tonight, starting with the process and overview, and it will be a lot of information. So I'm going to try and be brief with some of the slides, and at times it might seem like I'm going a little quick, but we'll pause at the end of each section to be able to see if anybody had any questions in the chat. I invite you to use the chat window. Mike will be monitoring that so that at the end of each section we can ask those questions. So let's move forward with process and overview. When we think about a district, what we really like to do is we like to compare it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because most districts, the hierarchy of needs is very, very similar. You start with the physical conditions. What shape are the buildings in? You move up to capacity and enrollment. Then you get into safety and security before working your way up into curriculum initiatives, how education is delivered, activity and community space, and how the communities use the buildings. You really need to address the base of that pyramid before you can work your way up to some of those higher level things. You have to take care of the physical conditions of the building. You have to make sure there's enough seats for the students. You have to make sure it's a safe environment. And above and beyond that, the teachers and the educational delivery impact the students far more than the facilities do, but it all plays part of that larger picture. When we think about the key components of a master plan, there's really three parts to it. What's in orange there is showing you where we are currently. We gather data and information, and we establish the facts as well as the needs, so that as a community, we can agree on what those needs are before we move forward into options. We do not start by coming up with options. We want to make sure that we have the needs defined first before moving forward. And so that's a critical part to our process before we move on to making recommendations to the board, and the board takes action on what to do. Tonight is not about options development. It's have we gathered all the data necessary to understand the need and start prioritizing that. So that's what we're going to ask you to focus on as we consider the information. And of the data we collect, there's lots of different things you're going to see. Some of it is very objective. It either is or it isn't. Physical conditions, you can say this needs to be repaired or replaced. Capacity of the buildings really is how many students could this building hold, et cetera, as you move forward. And other information is much more subjective. We gather that through discussions and interviews with the district staff, administration, principals, looking at how the buildings work for the education that they're delivering. But it all composes the information that we're going to be reviewing tonight. So let's start with just a basic overview of the district, because unless you're working in it day to day, you might not fully understand what's there. There are 7 schools within the district, as well as 3 operational buildings. And in total, it's a little over 720,000 square feet, which is very significant if you think about the size of a typical house is around 2,000 square feet. Of those schools, 4 of them are kindergarten through 4th grade, represented in the colored boundary areas, and one of them is a K-8 school. The students who go through the kindergarten through 4th grade schools, all of those students move on forward into Frederick, which houses 5th and 6th grade, and Grays Lake Middle School, which houses 7th and 8th. But if you attend Park, you attend your entire kindergarten through 8th grade in that facility. So that's a inventory of the district. I also like to start by thinking a little bit about what was the building history like and what story does that tell us? And if you think about the story of CCSD 46, there was a period of time about 23 years from 1950 to 1973 where there was extensive construction going on and 3 new buildings built at that time, your oldest buildings, Avon Center, Woodview, and Grays Lake Middle School. Those buildings also had significant additions and renovations during that period up until 1973. And there actually was a 10-year gap between 63 and 70 when that last addition was put on, followed by 18 years of no construction within the district. So those 3 buildings serving the district all the way up through 1991 when the next round of construction started. So from 91 to 96, 2 more buildings, or excuse me, 2 more rounds of additions were done. And then starting in 1995, 4 new buildings built. So the 4 newest buildings on campus, Meadowview, Frederick, Prairie View, and Park campus were all done, followed by some additions again at Avon Center and Woodview. And now we're in another period of no construction. So since 2007, for 16 years, no construction has been occurring. So you can see the trends of buildings, additions, and renovations. It also frames the 3 older buildings against the 4 newer buildings. The next thing we do is we start by just looking at building comparison and getting a general overview of what the district has. We look at the size of the sites as well as any adjacent public land next to it, because those complement school buildings often, how many parking spaces we have, how many buses we accommodate, and the buildings in general in terms of size, the number of students that are enrolled, the square feet per student, and just some general information about those buildings. What we find with the district, just from an overview summary, as just looking at this from the highest level, the site sizes meet the standards for schools, especially when you include the adjacent properties. There are some property issues that may want to be addressed because some of the property is shared with the Park District and has property lines that either run through a building in one case or through parking areas. But the district works very well with the Park District in terms of how things work. Also, our square foot per student is reasonable. Our Prairie View and Park campus are a little bit high, meaning there's more square feet per student than what the guidelines would show, while Woodview, Frederick, and GMS are slightly lower than what the guidelines are, but they're all within the guidelines. Some of the sites would be difficult to accommodate future additions if considered or if needed. And so that's something we want to keep our eye on as we move forward in the process, as well as an interesting fact, and we'll talk about this later. The current traffic patterns on site have been modified from the original designs, which really illustrate a challenge to the way parking was designed to work initially. And we'll look at that a little bit later tonight. But that's a quick overview of the buildings before we go into physical conditions. Mike, any questions so far?
Vaughn, we just have one chat question. Is there an inventory of outdoor spaces such as fields and solar farms? Playgrounds such as parking lots as well?
Not specific to what's being presented tonight, but that is information if needed that we can pull together very easily. Most of the field spaces are actually not district spaces, they are Park District spaces. And so we didn't include those in our inventory other than talking with the Park District about what spaces they have. And then most of our focus was also on the educational portions of the site as opposed to things like solar, but we did look at outdoor classrooms, which we're going to talk about tonight as well.
Okay, great.
All right, let's move forward then into physical conditions. So physical conditions, the best way to think about this is the type of thing that any one of us who has asset management to do, whether it be a house, a car, or some other type of investment, we need to maintain those things to keep them in working order. And it's really the same with the schools. It's either good condition or it needs to be addressed. And so these are maintenance items that need to be done regardless of any other renovations a district would look at doing in terms of educational delivery or how the buildings are functioning. So our methodology for that is walking through the spaces, every single space, to review the conditions, meeting with the district's team of maintenance engineers and operations to look at what issues they know about, and then developing a list of repairs that need to be addressed along with cost estimates based on life cycle, urgency, and other planning factors for the buildings. The categories that we look at include site, parking, paving, sidewalks, what condition are they in? The exterior envelope of the building, the walls, doors, and windows. Roofs, we look at by themselves because it's a very large item. Interior work, finishes, accessibility, doors and hardware. Life safety issues like fire alarms or building code issues, mechanical and plumbing, electrical, commissioning, which is really how do the systems operate within the building, as well as incorporation of annual district maintenance plans in the buildings. And this is something that the district has a long history of looking at. If we just look back to the round of studying this back in 2010, that was updated in 2013. We conducted a health and life safety survey in 2018, working alongside Train, who's another consultant the district utilizes. A mechanical and electric plan was developed in 2021, updating the infrastructure systems. We did our facility assessment starting in 2021, which was incorporated by the board in 21, but also updated as part of this process in 23. And the outcome includes all costs and appendices, a 10-year maintenance plan, health and life safety plans, capital budget for the district use, as well as the district's 3-year priority capital plan. So it's a pretty extensive process because there's a lot of things to maintain as you go into the buildings. So here's a snapshot of what we're looking at. And first, it's by category. So again, these are a lot of numbers. Instead of going through the numbers, I thought it might be helpful to look at this in terms of a pie chart. This will be available for you to look at if you're a numbers person. But let's jump to the pie chart and look at where does most of the work occur. And it's not really a surprise to us that roofing represents a significant cost. The district is already working on a mechanical and electrical plan implemented with Train, and that's addressing the needs effectively, but there's 4 buildings that have sections of roof pending in the next 10 years, and that represents the largest of our costs here. Interior work in the older 3 buildings is also a pretty significant amount of the work happening there, and that's not a surprise if you think about the age of those buildings. Another thing you might be interested in would be looking at it building by building to determine how much maintenance is planned for each one of the facilities. And you might think that the older the building, the more maintenance it has due to it, but it's really not the case. Again, if we look at the pie charts, it has more to do with the life cycle components of what's happening at the building. Right now, Park Campus actually has a significant amount of work because it has roofing work to be done in the next 10 years, as well as parking lots in the next 5 years, and a building automation system, the controls that operate the mechanical systems in the next 3 to 5 years. And it's similar at Prairie, and that's simply because based on when they were built, they're approaching that 20-year life cycle mark, which was when a lot of these things need to be addressed. The 3 older buildings certainly do have their share of work, interior work and roofing, some unit ventilator replacement, which is mechanical systems at Woodview, as well as the remaining mechanical and electrical work prioritized in the Train approach. And I will point out that the district has a very solid approach to how they handle maintenance in the building, focused primarily on flooring, ceilings, and cabinetry or caseworks in the building. So they're taking very good care of the buildings. To summarize, and again, we're a lot of details, but just to summarize that, building maintenance is really an absolute need. There's a reason it's the base of the pyramid. It's because it has to be planned for as part of that primary focus. And every component to a building has a life cycle for when it's going to be due. Being on top of maintenance prevents a major emergency from happening. And it is the foundation for a quality learning environment. You may not associate it immediately with that, but there's very strong data that ties things like air quality, lighting, temperature, and acoustics to how well students perform. if you look at the total amount and say 36 million seems like a lot, over the next 10 years, it's actually appropriate. One of the benchmarks we look at is either making an annual investment of 2% of the replacement cost of the building, or approximately, based on today's dollars, about $5 a square foot, which if you break that 36 million down, 3.6 million a year, it works out perfectly to that. What that shows you is that the district has been doing an outstanding job of being on top of this. And I want to point out that the district is currently financing 9.2 million, so a little over 3 million a year for their 3-year priority capital plan. That it runs through fiscal year 2024, and it's prioritized items from the original $15.7 million report that was presented last December. But that's a 3-year approach to doing this, and it needs a funding strategy to address those outstanding items, because the remaining $27 million is pending within that next 10 years. So our recommendation to the district is to continue to look at how to develop a funding strategy annually around that $3 to $4 million mark to invest in those items. Very quick summary of physical conditions. Any questions in the chat to address now?
Not right now, Vaughn. Certainly would want to encourage anybody, if they have a question, to put it in the chat. But
And
we're good to go.
Okay. I want to stress, I know this is a lot of information that we're putting out right now towards everybody, and I encourage you to review the information at your leisure online. We'll move forward into capacity versus enrollment. So this is that next layer of the pyramid up. It's a fairly objective piece of information that we look at. And quite simply, capacity is the ability of a school to hold the number of students and programs each year and into the projected future. It's not just as simple as counting up classrooms, because every year it can change. A change in space can change the overall capacity of a building from year to year. Assigning classrooms to labs, student services, small group or resource spaces from what they were originally also may overall reduce the overall capacity for a building. And room assignments will vary from year to year based on the programming that's happening. From a district standard, they've defined the number of seats per room as a fundamental component of how they operate. So for CCSD 46, at early childhood, we're operating at 20 students per room maximum. Grades kindergarten through 4th, 25 students per classroom maximum, and grades 5 through 8, 30 students per maximum. So that sets the basis for how our numbers start to work out. So here's 2 different examples of how capacity is calculated, because we look at it differently at the kindergarten through 4th grade level than we do at the 5th through 8th grade level, or elementary versus secondary, if you're used to those terms. So at the kindergarten through 4th, let's say there are 20 classrooms. 4 each for kindergarten through 4th grade. Students are either in their classroom, sometimes you might think about that as a homeroom, or they're out at a specialist room, art, music, phy-ed. So when we count spaces at that grade level, we are counting the classroom spaces that they're assigned to as opposed to the specialist spaces. Student services room, special education, we do not count those unless the students are in that room similar to a homeroom for the majority of their day. So from just an example standpoint, if we had 20 classrooms in a building times the 25 students per classroom, the capacity is 500 students total capacity, assuming your students come in even numbers from kindergarten all the way through 4th grade. At 5th through 8th grade, now our students are moving around. If you remember when you followed a schedule and moved from class to class, so now instead of looking at just classrooms, we look at teaching stations for where they move, any room that's scheduled out. So ideally, stations are scheduled on that period, allowing for, a portion of the day, allowing for a prep period in there. So now art, music, phy-ed, or any other type of space like that that's scheduled out counts in the scheduling. And once we assume the preparation period in there, we have a utilization of about 85% of the day on average for that classroom. And that's whether you take 5 out of 6 periods, 6 out of 7, 7 out of 8, it works out to be around that 85% utilization. So let's say there was 30 teaching stations in the building, and we have 30 students average per teaching station or maximum, times that 85% utilization factor, that's going to mean that building would hold 765 students, because that's how they'd be able to be scheduled out within the building. There are factors, though, that weigh into this that we should talk about a little bit. Student services or special education, sometimes based on standards or requirements, the total number of students per room is going to be lower than what the district standards are. CDAL, or early childhood special education, MILE, for example, those are all limited to 10 students per room based on the instructor and the need. And so we count those at a lower rate. And for multilingual, even though the rooms count at the 25 or 30 student per space level, you may not have that many non-English speakers enrolled in that grade level. So for example, I put on here, let's say there were 72 third graders enrolled in the building. 60 of those students would be English speaking and 12 would be our bilingual non-English speakers. The way that would have to be addressed is if you just took the simple math, you'd say 72 students divided by 25 per room, that only needs 3 classrooms. However, our bilingual students at 12 students, they may be in a classroom, but that's the only, that's how many are going to be in that room. So the remaining students would be allocated to 3 classrooms, about 20 each. So instead of the 3 that you do by math, it's actually going to require 4 classrooms when you factor in all those students. Sometimes grades will be combined together in this case. So for example, first and second may be together in one classroom to get a higher utilization rate, as opposed to having 1 or 2 students only in a full-size classroom. As we look at what's our total capacity then for the district and how we calculate that out, our early childhood students, it's about 135 student capacity. That varies a little bit based on the, what type of students are enrolled and how often the classrooms can be blended. But more concrete at our kindergarten through 4th grade, those schools are total capacity of 2,365 students. 5th and 6th grade, Park and Frederick, total 1,075 students. There's a slight variation there. The students at Park operate more in a contained model, like the K4 way of structuring the building, while Frederick operates in a scheduled model. So they move students around the building like the middle school does, as do the 7th and 8th graders at Park West. So our capacity for 7th and 8th grade students is 1,095. The reason this is important is that when we take a look at how the students move through the buildings, we want to make sure that as they move through the elementary levels, kindergarten through 4th grade, by the time they get to 5th through 6th and 7th through 8th, that the number of seats and the capacity of those buildings is in alignment with the other buildings. If the capacity was much larger at the K through 4 and we didn't have enough seats at 5th and 6th and 7th through 8th, we would know that we likely need an addition to handle the capacity as they move forward. But with the way the buildings are structured, they're in very strong balance. You can see just the 2 grade levels alone from 5th and 6th to 7th and 8th are within 20 students of each other. So that's very positive when we look at the capacities for the buildings. But none of this makes any difference unless you look at enrollment to the number of students coming in. So the information you're seeing in front of you now is from a demographic study that was prepared by John Casarda, who's a consulting demographer, a very, very strong one in Illinois. And it's ideal to have a third party do the enrollment projections because they're looking at it without the bias that the district might have, or certainly we might have as the architects. And so they look at out from a 10-year perspective where those demographics may end up. And that helps us base our understanding of where the projections are compared to the capacity. However, I will point out that the district also tracks that annually because they want to know if the information in the report prepared by Dr. Casarda is tracking accurately or not. And what we're finding is that it is tracking very accurately with the exception of one building, which is a positive. Woodview was looking like it was going to be pushing the capacity of that building, if not being over capacity. But when the district looks at the actual enrollment for this year, as well as the projections for next year, it puts it more in line with where Meadowview is, for example, and it is not over capacity as a result. So when we look at the rest of the buildings, they have adequate capacity to handle the number of students coming in. And with the adjusted look at Woodview, monitoring actual students compared to their report, that one has adequate capacity as well. So to summarize capacity versus enrollment, the district has adequate capacity to prepare for the 10-year window that's looking out from a projection standpoint. Our recommendation is to keep watching Woodview to make sure that the actual enrollment does not vary up to the levels that it was in the report. And if necessary, there are options to address future issues of capacity if they would come up, and it does not look likely in the next 10 years, with things like a boundary adjustment or maybe programming adjustments, which programs that are not part of the straightforward kindergarten through 8th grade are located in each building. So that's very positive from an enrollment and capacity standpoint. Mike, chat before we go on to the next section.
Sure, Vaughn, we have one question. What ratio of ELA special ed ratios do you use when evaluating a school? Is it on an average based on the current enrollment and projections? Is it different from each school? So they're asking about what's the ratio of ELA?
I probably will
special ed.
have to have the district answer that more than
Okay.
we will, and that may be something that we have to follow up on, but the district,
I can answer.
you can answer that? Thank you, Lynn.
Yes, absolutely. So if we're asking a question about our multilingual program, so our bilingual or multilingual program, that capacity is meant to be 90% of the capacity of an English only classroom. I think that might be what the first part of that question is asking. It says ELA, but I'm interpreting it to be multilingual. So then it depends on what the average class size is for a grade. The multi-language class should be 90% of that. For special education, and I think this question must be specifically about our special programs such as Link and Mile. Those are not based on the capacity of the school or enrollment projections. They are really capped classes. And so then we're looking at 10 students per class. At least that's what it is for Mile.
Okay, thank you, Lynn.
Welcome.
And there's just one other question. Were walking and biking and pedestrians included in the traffic analysis, the traffic flow? Were they considered? Correct.
Considered, yes, but not part of what we're looking at from the initial safety standpoints, but it is part of the overall. And I can address that when we get to that in the presentation.
Okay.
You will hear a little bit more about the language program a little bit later, and we'll refer back to how that may or may not impact capacity as we move forward. But for now, let's move on to safety and security. I don't have to stress how important safety and security is. And I also point out that while we do study an awful lot of information, that is not going to be presented tonight because obviously it's sensitive material. We wouldn't want any of that to be in the wrong hands. And so when we put information on the district website for public consumption, we want to make sure that we're being sensitive about that. I will talk a little bit about our methodology as well as the categories we took a look at, and then provide an overview for that as we go forward. So this is very similar to the physical conditions where we're looking at building plans, site plans, and talking with the buildings about how things work. It's very easy for us to look at what safety features are in place and how those compare to best practices for districts. Another faction of our firm is focused on government work. As I said, we do a lot of public sector work. And so we use their methodology for looking at detention facilities, emergency operations centers, police facilities, to look at all the different variations that we might have on that as we come in. And we know many of those are not appropriate when we talk about education, because you're balancing a welcoming learning environment with the safety features that have to go into the building. So we're looking at things like the entry sequence, because that's really the front line for schools. Visibility, office locations, do we have secure access to the buildings? The building perimeters themselves, doors and windows, what types of monitoring systems are in place, site features like lighting and observation, interior circulation, primarily around building lockdown points and zoned access control, classrooms, hardware, visibility, resilience of the space. And so in summary, and again, I hope you understand why we're not displaying all the information studied. I can tell you that the buildings really provide secure entries with controlled access for all visitors during the school hours. They're handling things in terms of best practices, not only there, but the buildings throughout are operated with great general practices for what we see for educational facilities. We really don't have red flags that we would bring to the district's attention in terms of, hey, this is a problem, we should probably take a look at this. So there are things that we might consider. And this points towards the safety and traffic sequence piece. We talked a little bit about how site access comes into the site, where there are trails, where there are bike areas, but the primary thing that we're looking at is how buses and parents or visitors come to the schools. And there's a trend that's happening not only in your district, but throughout districts across the US. And that's an increase in parent drivers exceeding the original designs and practices. You used to have much smaller areas for pickup at the end of the day, as well as drop off, and more students took the bus to school or rode their bicycles. But over the years, and especially post-COVID, we have more and more parents driving their students to school and picking their students up after school. Some of that's mixed with where bus routes go and times on buses. Some of that's mixed just with parents and their work schedules wanting to make something more convenient for their students. But what's happened is we've moved vehicular traffic into old bus areas and bus areas into old vehicular traffic areas as much as possible. And part of that is to just get cars off of the street. When you have that many cars stack up, they tend to spill back out into the street and cause traffic issues for the rest of the community. So we like to see those contained on site as much as possible. The district has adapted how they've done this at just about every building. Only 2 buildings remain as designed in terms of the traffic flow, where the buses and the cars were completely separated from each other. One area that's a little bit confusing is at Frederick, where instead of having buses lined up in an area, the buses actually come in side by side, and it just depends on which bus arrives at what point during the day for the pickup. And the students look at a chart to figure out where their bus is going to be that day as they move out to it, and they move between the buses. The buses are off, so it's safe from that standpoint, but it is a little bit congested and confusing in the back there. So from a consideration standpoint, as you think about traffic sequence, it would be fairly extensive and expensive, but looking at the entire site for every one of the buildings and saying, I know we've modified traffic to flow where we have paving and roads currently. Do we need to look at completely redesigning how traffic moves on the site to get more of our vehicles on site and recognize the fact that we've got a larger visitor and parent pickup at the end of the day? It may not even be feasible with the size of some of the sites. They're adequate in terms of space when you look at the adjacent areas, but when we're adding that much more traffic onto a site, it has other implications, including microclimate, additional stormwater management. So it may be something that in the end, the district says, we understand that, but that's an expense or remedy to a problem that we don't necessarily think is a high priority. So I wanted to point that out as part of our study too, because it is something that we take a look at. Questions before we move on to curriculum initiatives and delivery?
Why don't we just have one question that's more of a follow-up to the special ed classroom proportionality. I think it might be better if we maybe do a direct follow-up with Liz on some of the details. Okay.
In that case, then let's move forward to curriculum initiatives and delivery. So this is really getting down into what do we actually do in schools? We teach in schools, students learn in schools. So how do the spaces work for what we're trying to do in them? So much like we start by looking at a general overview of the district in terms of the buildings, we do the same type of thing when we're looking at spaces. As part of our process here, while we're doing our capacity analysis of the buildings and talking with the administration, we're also asking questions about how does your building work? What do you have trouble with? What's working well? Looking at analysis of plans and visiting every single building. So we start by just looking at, from a space standpoint, how do the spaces compare both to guidelines for how large that room should be? So for example, a classroom in that 800 to 900 square feet range, how do they compare to each other? Because you want to have some consistency in your buildings, and how do they work for the function included? And on this chart, you can see there's some spaces that are indicated by a red box, some that are indicated by a green box. A red box would really say, hey, this is operating a little low compared to those standards. We should probably take a look at this. A green box would say that's quite large for what the standards are. And I will point out that as we think about this, just because it's flagged or shows up as red does not necessarily mean that it's a problem. It may function quite adequately and be a low priority. In talking with the principals, they might say, oh yeah, that room's a little bit smaller, but it works just fine. Our bigger issue is over here in this area. It may not be feasible to correct some of those issues. So for example, a classroom size that's around 800 square feet, if you have several classrooms in a row, it's not as simple as saying, well, just move the exterior wall out another 2 feet to get that total classroom size in place. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that it can be addressed, but identifying that might give us options as we move forward that we can consider. For example, when we were just talking about our language students, where we might only have 12 in a standard size classroom, maybe instead of 2 classrooms side by side that are 800 square feet, you could divide those up into 3 medium-sized classrooms if that's one of the priorities that you face. So it gives us something to think about as we move forward. Again, overall, I would say this is our total square foot per student. We see that we're a little higher square foot per student on 2 of our newer buildings, Prairie View and Park, and we're a little lower on some of our older buildings. And what that might tell us is if we're thinking about additions anywhere, maybe it needs to be at one of the buildings where our square foot per student is a little lower. Again, not to go into a tremendous amount of detail on this, but what I would tell you from looking at the overall square footage, just objectively, the classrooms, which is one of the very first things we look at, really good. They're within the minimal guidelines, within that 800 to 900 square feet, with only a few classrooms outside of that. We do see more variation at kindergarten size rooms. Kindergarten was originally designed larger because the students spent most of their day in those rooms. So you saw those up around 1,200 square feet. But as districts move from half-day kindergarten to all-day kindergarten, in order to get the spaces to work out, they had to look at classroom spaces that were often around that 800 to 900 square feet. And it was more desirable to have the programming than the larger space. So that's another example of, yes, we know it's smaller, but it works well for us. As we mentioned, our multilingual classrooms may be oversized or underutilized, depending on how you're looking at it, depending on the current enrollment. If the district was to switch from one-way language to two-way dual language format, where you had a blended environment of both English speakers and non-English speakers, those classrooms would be up towards that 25 student range or 30 at the middle school levels. Our specialist rooms, it's not really a surprise that at the older buildings like Avon or Woodview, for example, maybe a little small, especially if they're now in rooms that were never designed for it in the first place, like a music room or an art room in an area that wasn't originally designed for that. There's one specialist room to point out at both Avon and Meadowview, and that's the gym spaces, which are half the size of other buildings. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get up to the activities and community use piece, but it's also an issue for Phi-Ed. If you have half the gym space of the other buildings, that presents challenges for what types of things you're going to do in a physical education space. We see that our science labs at Frederick are a little small compared to standards, but they're also, the way that building works is they have a science classroom in one area, and then they share a lab space. So it's not a combined lecture lab component like we might see at some middle schools. It's a little bit different. And so those seem to be working okay as well. Other comparisons, when we start looking through, even though there's not a square footage definition around outdoor learning spaces, we do see that there's some inconsistencies in the district in outdoor learning areas. There's some variety there in terms of the types of spaces, as well as some buildings that have them and some that don't. We'll go into that in more detail as we move forward here, but that's an opportunity for some wider engagement. From a functional standpoint, we have a few buildings where our kitchens are quite small. Most of the kitchens in the district are what we call servery kitchens as opposed to preparation kitchens. So food is prepared at a different site and then it's only served at the buildings themselves. But when the kitchen serving space is too small, those lines, the cashiers, they tend to spill out into the cafeteria space. And so that puts some pressure on where the students are eating. Overall, total square foot per student may inform us for options development, as I talked about, but we're not seeing huge issues that immediately need to be addressed, other than maybe some recommendations around the things that I brought up, like gym spaces. In looking at spaces now that you would think of in terms of learning space challenges, again, we start with the classroom space. Not only are we looking at the size of it, but how the spaces lay out themselves, looking for consistency. There's a few things to note here. At the time these were built, 24 or less was the standard capacity. But if you have 25 students in a classroom and you only have 24 lockers built into it, you have to come up with some accommodations to where students are going to store their personal belongings. In the 90s, there was a lot of what we call power and data towers. And you can see that in the upper left photo there, which had power and computer lines run to every one of those desk areas so that students could plug in directly. Now with much better improvements in terms of personal devices, those are not needed. And so those really could be removed to provide more flexibility to the classrooms. We are seeing consistency in terms of the writing boards, the whiteboards. They're not exactly the same from room to room, but the idea is the same throughout the district. And we did note that flexible furniture does greatly improve the functionality of a space. And flexible furniture is simply chairs and desks or tables that can easily be moved around to configure the room differently. The district has started purchasing flexible furniture over the past few years, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail coming up here. There's also things called flexible learning spaces directly adjacent to classroom areas where you can have direct pullout, one-on-one assistance, small group learning projects that basically are extensions of that classroom area in a wider variety. And they're highly utilized where they exist. We'll look at that momentarily as well. Specialist rooms, as I mentioned, where we have music and art not in original locations. Sometimes they lack appropriate amenities, maybe not enough storage, for example. We have some areas where the rooms feel very challenged. The middle school band room, for example, at 110 students is very crowded. That's probably more a factor of the popularity of that program as opposed to the room space itself. Yes, if you have 110 students in an area that was maybe not intended to accommodate that many originally, you're going to have some challenges that go with that. So that may be something where we have to take a look at it from a programming initiative standpoint. In addition to the undersized gyms, there's also considerable conversation around not everything is a court space when we think about Phi-Ed. Weights, cardio, other types of activities, not just for students, but the community, may be something we want to consider if you're looking at how to rectify the size issue at a gym standpoint. Computer labs have become almost obsolete in schools as we've moved into different ways of handling that technology. And that may go hand in hand with STEM spaces, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Again, we'll talk about that in just a moment because all of these curriculum and initiative-based issues are connected. When we look at student services spaces, really, we have our two newest buildings are identified as the district standard for what great spaces look like when we're looking for student services. We're a little short when we look at sensory and therapy type spaces, and many of the spaces were not originally designed to accommodate the specific needs of those students. So we have rooms that are being subdivided by furniture or other types of things like bookcases to make smaller areas, converting them into the smaller learning environments. And many of the rooms that are utilized for special education, let's face it, back in the 50s, those rooms really were never designed to accommodate what we now know about students and how to help them with the needs in those spaces. So they weren't designed for the type of equipment we have now or the functions of the needs as specifically as we see newer buildings being designed. So there's some things that we could take a look at in terms of student services as well. We also talked to districts about what are you thinking about doing in the future? What future district initiatives do you have coming up from a teaching and learning standpoint so we can make sure there are spaces that accommodate those types of things? So not associating them with spaces specifically, the district said, we really are looking at how we handle STEM or STEAM labs in the district, implementing either two-way dual language and or world language, bringing language programming back into the classroom areas, expanding what we do with our outdoor learning areas, as well as possibly even creating a newcomer center to assist our non-English speaker students who are new to American schools. So things that the district is looking at, we try and determine, are there space issues that we need to be thinking about to accommodate those into the future? So we sometimes refer to those as learning space opportunities. So let's take a look at those. I just mentioned STEM or STEAM or maker lab spaces. And what these are is essentially introducing students to science, technology, engineering, art is the A in that to convert it to STEAM, or mathematics. And really they're hands-on learning spaces. They're flexible, they allow for a variety of experiments to happen, and it's really part of a contemporary educational design approach. Just about every new elementary school that we're designing has these types of spaces in it, as well as middle schools and high schools. They have increased power and data, project storage, flexible and movable furniture, and a lot of display and presentation areas. So from thinking about the district, do you have the ability to adapt and accommodate to those? Absolutely. I mentioned the former computer lab spaces that are very underutilized now. These make ideal STEM lab spaces. They already have the power and the data in them, and they need updating as it is. They have those power and data towers in them. They are spaces that need to be adapted to be utilized better. And some of the buildings are already using them as is. They're moving into them because that's a space that's available. If they can be connected to media centers, to outdoor learning areas, art spaces, even better. And so that's one of the areas that we think is a strong consideration for the district to take a look at, implementing those in the buildings to match future programming. Another area related to that is media centers. And we've seen a vast change in media centers over the past 2 decades. They're one of the probably the most constantly evolving spaces we look at. It's a greater incorporation of digital to mix with the printed media, variety of spaces and large group meeting areas, presentation space, and they're no longer the shh, be quiet, we're reading quiet spaces. They're engaged and active. They're very social spaces. We're seeing fewer bookshelves on the floor and moving them out of those areas so they don't take up as much square feet without losing the collection. What we call shifting the secure line. So where the entrance to the media center is and where things are locked up compared to the types of spaces that are in it. Spaces that are meeting spaces for small groups, community groups after school, tables, chairs, things that don't necessarily have to be secured. We can move where that line is back further so we can secure our books, our technology, some of our equipment we have in the schools, but make those spaces available to the public and other groups outside of that time, as well as create more common spaces for flexible learning for students. It's aligned to the design and exploration process as well, going to the media center to understand what you're attempting to do and then doing it out in the specialist areas. So are your spaces adaptable? Yes, your media spaces are well located in the buildings. They're very central. They're aligned to where the classrooms are. They have some rigid features like half walls or entry points that are making them a little bit more difficult to utilize as they are, but improvements would correct that. And renovations would actually address where you have a couple that are a little bit smaller at Avon and Woodview, not tremendously smaller, but renovations could improve the functionality of those areas as well. Editing studios, greater variety of furniture, movable shelves, all part of that environment. So that's a second consideration from a learning space opportunity we would recommend. A third one is this idea of flexible learning spaces. So this is a diagram of Prairie View. You have flexible learning spaces in 3 of your buildings currently, Prairie View, Park Campus, and Meadowview. These are small extended learning environments directly adjacent to groups of classrooms to accommodate more of that direct pull-out instruction, group activities. They're visible from the classroom so that the instructors can see what the students are doing. And as I mentioned, you have this model in 3 of your buildings right now. The way it works is it replaces underutilized corridor space, meaning it's only used for circulation in between classes with actual learning space. I myself was a student who spent a lot of my time out in a hallway with a teacher's aide as opposed to in an actual learning environment when I was in elementary school. They're typically associated with groups of classrooms, and we see them in variations at all grade levels. In fact, the students, as they move from your district to D127, the high school, they have these types of environments as well. So from a consideration, are your spaces adaptable? Ideally, you would add these types of spaces to the buildings that don't have them right now to create consistency across your buildings. Avon Center, Woodview, Frederick, GMS, all fairly possible to do that. Woodview might be a little difficult unless we look at the capacity and how that's handled in that building, because there are limited room for additions on the site. So that would be part of an option study you would take a look at that time. Some other things that would enhance the learning environment in buildings, even where you have it, would be more visibility between the classroom and that area, or even greater physical connection between those, operable walls and sliding door systems to have the space flow from the classroom directly out to that flexible learning environment. So this is an opportunity to create consistency across the buildings within the district. And the final learning space opportunity that I'll point out, or excuse me, not the final, second to last one, furnishings. I mentioned the district has started purchasing more what we call flexible furnishings. And there's a diagram on the side that you'll see there. It was not created by us. It was created by a furniture company we do a lot of work with called BS, showing how with the right kit of parts, you can reconfigure a classroom space into multiple different types of learning environments easily. Furniture has come a long ways in the last 10 years. And with the right set of furniture, it's more important than the architecture itself in terms of how those spaces work. So From a consideration standpoint, continuing to invest into these types of furniture and replacing the old types of desks and chairs attached to the desks that are very difficult to set up in a room in any other way than in rows. And the final area that I want to touch on, I said that I made a mistake with the last one, outdoor learning spaces. So this is something that we've had quite a bit of current initiatives around. There was a community cafe that we were part of recently with a lot of discussion and dialogue in this. And there's been some great investments in outdoor learning spaces at some of the sites. A lot of that with PTO engagement. Some additional connections that would enhance that would be more definition around that from a teaching and learning standpoint. And I mentioned that that's one of the initiatives the district talked to us about coming soon in the future, as well as the possibility of community partnerships for a larger impact, going beyond the sites themselves, outside of what is district property. If we take a look at a comparison between the buildings, you can see any item that's marked in green is a space at that building that is really making some significant investment in those areas. Yellow is pretty close, it exists, and white doesn't exist. So you can see we have 3 sites there that really have some strong spaces: Meadowview, Prairie View, and Woodview. And here's some photos of those spaces as we take a look as well. So places for students to gather, to again be hands-on, much like a STEM lab or a STEAM lab, understand the connection between student and the environment and the impact we have, as well as the learning opportunities, not only for the students, but for the community as a whole. So from a consideration standpoint, implementing this at all schools so that that you have consistency, at least in the types of spaces that are across the board. Avon currently has a proposal that and I might be using the wrong terminology, but the PTO, the parent teacher organization, uses there. That one looks very strong. Frederick is using some of the areas, but they're not as developed as this. GMS has the courtyard that could be a possibility. And Park Campus has areas defined, but again, they're not as developed as these are. Some additional enhancements that could make these spaces work even better at each of the buildings would be increased connection to monitoring type systems. So you can measure how well the solar panels are doing, for example, or what the impact of those water control environments are on the building. More writing surfaces so that it's easier to take notes and to give small presentations when needed. More opportunities to study water management. Water management is a huge issue at all sites, and there's lots of things that can be done around that. Even smaller solar arrays than what the district is doing from building to building to study that could be an enhancement. And we took a look at the sites that don't have those right now and some ideas for how those might fit in. The Avon space that's shown is actually where is being proposed by the group there to put that. So from a consideration standpoint, we highly recommend implementing these at all schools to be able to accommodate some of those future programmings, as well as looking for some consistency defined by teaching and learning about the types of things that those might be used for, so that while there might be variation from site to site, there's a consistency in terms of the standard that would be applied to each of those. A lot of information around the educational uses, because obviously that's the most exciting part of it. So Mike, I see we have some chat discussion there. Can I answer some questions?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm going back to the inside of the building over at Frederick. The comment was the Frederick bleachers can't hold a whole student body at the same time. Did we flag that?
We didn't necessarily flag that. Oftentimes, we don't look at the bleachers as the ability to handle a whole student body. Sometimes you're using the floor space for that, but that is something that could be looked at further. I know that we also look at bleachers from a game standpoint in terms of what's happening there.
Okay. And then Frederick multipurpose room cannot hold all the students at each separate lunch. Was that evaluated or discussed when we looked at the buildings?
We do take a look at the capacity of the spaces like the cafeterias or the multi-purpose room to handle that. The district makes adjustments in terms of when they move students through those areas and how many students at a time they're seating. And so sometimes that's less a factor of the room as opposed to how many students are being put into that space at a time. And so that's something that we do consider as we take a look at overall scheduling.
Okay. And then for locker sizes, when we evaluated them, were they big enough to hold boots and coats, especially at the middle schools? or there are some adult sized students? So that was a key question there that somebody had.
I'd love to say that there's a standard guideline around locker sizes for what we look at for students, but they vary quite a bit from school to school. I would say that none of the lockers were designed to hold what students bring to school now currently, and they may not ever have been designed that way. A lot of schools were designed with the coat hook type environment where the boots were left in the corridors. And you still see that from building to building. Some of that is simply a factor of making sure that the boots have a chance to dry out in between recess periods, as well as making sure that students are moving through the spaces quickly and efficiently as they go forward. But I would say that that's a challenge that just about every building has, is trying to get not only the boots and the winter equipment in, but also backpacks and some of the other types of devices that are being brought that were never sized for lockers originally.
Okay. And then back when you were talking about enhancements to the learning space, would that require changes to the building's footprint?
It depends. So if, for example, if we're looking at creating flexible learning environments, it likely would require a change to the building footprint, because there are no spaces adjacent to the classrooms right now that you could say, oh, we'll just simply take that over. So you'd be looking at building some type of capacity addition to be able to accommodate creating those flexible environments outside the classrooms if you were doing that. There's diagrams that we've done for the buildings that show how that might take place. And as I mentioned, some of them are more challenging than others. Woodview is a very tight site with how it lays out, and we'd have to be very creative about how that would happen. But more than likely, those would require additions.
Okay. One more question here. If we convened a task force to determine standards and definitions for OLSs, could you point us to resources to begin our study?
We certainly could, and I think that's something that we'd have more dialogue with the district on. If that's something that comes out as a priority, we'd be happy to help you in terms of where to start and how to start talking about that with resources.
Sure. That was in reference to the outdoor learning spaces, which I think you had gone over. Okay. Yeah, that was the last question.
Okay. Great. Let's move on to activities and community use. And I realize we're at the 1 hour mark. I hope everybody's still interested in this and patient. I will try and get through these last few slides here so that we can have some question and answer, and then you can have the rest of your night free. Activities and community use. So this is everything that's happening beyond the school day and how the buildings are being used. And the group that really is the most engaged with this and scheduling this is park districts. They use both the insides and the outsides of the building. I mentioned most of the exterior fields are park district owned anyways, but they do schedule out quite a bit of the inside of the building in conjunction with the district. And you can see almost every single building has evening use scheduled into it around the gyms. Classroom areas are not an issue. Small gathering spaces, large gathering spaces, we have those spaces in the building. The multi-purpose areas are great for that. There's classrooms that are available. It's the gyms that have the biggest demand. And every single one of those is used, with the exception of Avon is used, but it's only used for small practices and activities because of the size of that gym. Meadowview gets scheduled out similar to the other gyms. They can't hold games in it because it's only half the size, but that multi-purpose room helps with that. Bleachers are needed for game capacity in those buildings. There was a question about Frederick and the student count in the bleachers. Really what was brought more to our attention was the bleacher need for games as opposed to student assembly. And so one of the questions that we simply looked at was, would we be able to accommodate gyms at either Avon or Meadowview that would be of appropriate size? It's a more challenging task than looking at simply flexible learning environments, for example. If you just look at Avon, the blue square there is the size of the current gym, but it's also the stage and the staircases that are inside that gym box. A new gym that would be one full-size court, about 6,500 square feet, not much larger than that. The site would be able to accommodate it, but we'd have to figure out scheduling because you would lose that stage as well as the use of the gym for the entire duration that construction was happening. And that may be a phasing issue that's just a deal breaker as you take a look at the buildings, for example. Meadowview, a lot more challenging. Where the gym is located currently, it's near the entry point, it's near the building service, it's near the kitchen where we've got a lot of infrastructure and utilities. And just to simply make it twice as big, wouldn't work from a structural standpoint. It completely obliterates the front door and it would move out into the parking area. However, as you're looking at options and additions, you might say, well, what if our priorities include relocating the office adjacent to the entry, addressing our bus and site issues on site, as well as the gym expansion? Now your options might be a little bit larger in terms of how you think about, oh, if you want to resolve all those issues at Meadowview, here's a way that we could do that. So it does start to point us towards, as we move into the options piece, are there things we could consider? But as it is, just simply making the gym larger at Meadowview would be a challenge. So there are issues that were identified, not easy solutions for how to rectify those. Questions on activity and community space before we get to our final category?
Somewhat related to community uses at Avon, at the Avon parking lot, was it evaluated for safe passage for the bike trail that travels through the site?
The bike trail actually comes in from the north for the most part. Where it comes in from the south, it does have some challenges there. I think we probably want to talk a little bit about site traffic patterns for all types of people approaching the site, whether they're pedestrian, bikers, or vehicles at each one of these as we move into the options category. Most of the time we're talking about the educational issues here, but as we develop options, we'll want to look at other scenarios on site and how those may be impacted by what we do, or how simple changes can impact that as we move forward.
Okay. And then were Meadowview's parking lot curb cuts near the handicap parking flagged? There's no curb cuts currently near the handicap parking spaces.
They were as part of the accessibility study.
Okay. And then do our art music spaces usage indicate any unmet needs? So art music spaces.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Do our art music spaces use indicate unmet needs? For example, at GMS, is the band room too small for the current use?
The band room right now with 110 students is certainly going to feel small as you go into that. Just in looking at the spaces themselves, there's space available for art and music. They have, I would say just about every district we ever talk to, storage is always an issue. Everybody wants more storage in their space, but there is storage that's available. There are sinks that are available. So they're overall, from a functionality standpoint, things work, but just as I noted in some of the older buildings, they're a little bit small.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vaughn.
Let's move on to the last category here, additional considerations. So this is really above and beyond everything else. Is there anything else that we're seeing or looking at, or that the district has asked us to look at, that we would consider? And the first one I would say is sustainability. It's a huge, important topic. If you are like me and concerned at all about what's happening with the environment, this is where it starts. And so there's several things that the district is doing. I want to highlight those, just like how well they're taking care of the buildings, because they're already doing a lot of different things that we took a look at. The mechanical and electrical systems that are currently being renovated as part of the approach that Train is working on are going to provide significant efficiencies, as well as the ability to monitor the systems. The district has put solar panels in at multiple sites, with continued investigation at the ones that don't have solar panels. Meadowview was the recipient of a Green Ribbon Scholars Award in 2019. The district has an established resource conservation committee, and the outdoor learning environments are spaces that are directly adjacent to this. What our comparison in looking at the study was evaluating the district against those green ribbon standards, simply because it's a practice you already have in place through Meadowview, and we like it because it's focused on education. There are additional criteria we could study and benchmarks. There's all sorts of standards you could take a look at, whether it's LEED or Energy Star, something that's a return on the investment that you put into it. Do you want to get to net zero operation? But we would need a lot more definition around what is the goal that you want to achieve before we were able to say, here's what you would do to have that in place. So that's why we focused on green ribbons and comparing the schools and the district to green ribbon standards. There's on the left there, you can read through the categories, but why is this important? As we said, it's reflective of things that you're already doing in the district and initiatives and approaches that have been taken. And it's specific to schools and educational environments. This is a U.S. Department of Education program. It's not a benchmark or a certification. I'm not a huge fan of those because those are simply check marks that say, did we do this or not do this? And there's winners and losers. This is more of about a mindset and growth in different behavior patterns that you can track annually. And it goes beyond the facilities themselves. It gets into operations, it gets into cleaning, it gets into the programming and how you're using the building. So it really is a holistic approach to education, and it goes beyond facilities. So we like it for that regard, but it's an ongoing conversation and collaboration. It requires participation at all levels. If this is something the district wanted to say, hey, we would be interested in pursuing this and developing standards around it, this is a great place to start that conversation or continue that conversation, if you will, as you take a look at it. So sustainable initiatives, a very important consideration that district should be looking at. And on top of that, the beginning of the presentation, I talked about 3 operational buildings that the district has. The district office, which is the former Frederick House, the ISC, which I don't even know the family name that you would put to that, but it's another house near GMS, as well as the maintenance buildings. Currently, the district functions are split up into 2 separate sites that are those houses. There's a lack of meeting space. There's very little departmental collaboration just in terms of how those areas have had to been subdivided. And in total, that's about 4,500 square feet. We have had a lot of work with districts on creating appropriate office environments to increase collaboration, training, development, and functionality of district administrative functions. And we would highly recommend the district think about, is there a way to look at a consolidated approach that would be a single location, approximately 10,000 square feet, so about twice the size of what's there currently. And that is simply just based on looking at how difficult and how small some of those areas are. That would either be through a new lease facility, possibly the construction of a new building if site space was available, but that's something I think should be part of the long-term considerations for the district. Then the other offsite building would be the maintenance buildings. And I bring this up not because they're not adequate for the storage functionalities, but these are buildings that are having meetings with the operations and maintenance staff located in them. Typically, we see the operations program co-located with these buildings. They are currently in the Frederick House. When they do have meetings in the building, they're dirt floors. There's no heat. There's no appropriate meeting space. It's simply gathering around inside the sheds to have these meetings. So a relocation of operations adjacent to these through an addition onto those that would be heated with appropriate space of about 3,000 square feet would be a consideration. So just some additional things to think of. And before we go into some final questions, just to summarize this, because as I said, a lot of information to give you in just over an hour, a summary of the needs. So at the physical conditions level, even after the $9.2 million that the district is currently investing over the next 3 years, there's $27 million remaining to be addressed over that 10-year life cycle. From a capacity enrollment standpoint, there is adequate capacity, but the district should continue to watch Woodview, so that's not as much of a significant need. Safety and security, there are opportunities to address traffic on site that would be more expensive, but there may be things that are less expensive that would include not only vehicles and buses, but also pedestrians and bikes, and potentially make the sites more friendly for pedestrians and bikes to reduce the amount of cars on site that we could take a look at as far as the options go. Curriculum initiatives and delivery, there's ways to update and elevate the buildings to be more in line with the newer facilities, consistent with the buildings across the district, that would update older spaces as well as prepare yourself for the pending initiatives coming forward. Activities and community space, gyms are always an issue, but in particular, your 2 smaller gyms in the district, as well as consistency across the outdoor learning spaces, which is a relatively easy investment to make throughout the district. And then from another standpoint, sustainability, having guideline or practice that the district can follow above and beyond the current board policies would take it to the next level, and consideration for appropriate office and operations space. So a quick summary of the needs here, and I'll pause now to answer some questions before we conclude the presentation.
Okay, we have a couple questions here. One related to maintenance. Are you looking at disinfection and its efficacy of the buildings, or is this beyond the scope of what we're looking at?
It would certainly be beyond our scope as the architects looking at this, but I know that the district has a very extensive cleaning program that aligns with green practices that they've been looking at, and that's probably a more appropriate question for building operations.
Okay, and then related to sustainability, are there any further recommendation based on Wold's AIA 2030 commitment as part of what we're working on? Is there any further recommendations that we would have?
We could go a lot more in depth on that. Reference to our 2030 challenge. Really what we're talking about with every single one of our clients is there a possibility to be net zero in your buildings, to have your carbon footprint be at that net zero capacity? It's very relevant when you're doing large scale renovation or addition type projects, or especially new construction. But with the other things that you're doing, developing a long-term plan for how to move in that direction to get to that would be something that we would be very interested in helping the district develop if that's a priority. Remember, what we're talking about right now is we've identified areas of opportunity or needs that we see. The next step is really for the district to say, these are the things that we think we need to be focusing on right now so that our options are in alignment with that. And if that is a goal of the district, that would absolutely be part of the priorities.
Okay. And then one question here, does the capacity study suggest a need for enhanced art spaces, music spaces, acoustics, storage, for example?
Capacity doesn't necessarily, because capacity is simply looking at the rooms, but the functionality of the rooms could point towards that. We tended to leave off things that we saw as maintenance items because those are covered in the maintenance report. So things like this cabinet door needs to be replaced, etc. But acoustics, if highlighted to us, would stand out as something that we would want to address. But those are fairly simple to look at as well. So functionality is a little different than capacity. Capacity is, does it hold the number of students? Functionality is, how is it working?
Okay. Did the capacity study look at future incoming students with specific needs like multi-language or special ed?
The CSRD report, and I'm speaking on their behalf right now, was really looking at more district growth and development, but that is something that the district looks at regularly through the student services program as well as the language program, in trying to identify incoming projections for those students. It's a little bit more difficult because you don't know who is going to be moving into the district and when, but the district does monitor that from a year-to-year basis, and they could answer that question in more detail.
Okay, great. So some good questions there, and that was the last one.
Okay, and I will actually, that's a great transition here, in that this is not the only opportunity to provide feedback, input, to ask questions. And maybe this is where, Lynn, I'll turn it over to you as we talk about next steps here, and then we'll wrap it up together.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Vaughn. So tomorrow afternoon, we will be posting 3 items on our website. This video, actually 4, come to think of it, this video, a PDF of the presentation so people can carefully go through the presentation, then a draft version of the report, because this presentation is based on a very lengthy report that Wold put together for us that goes very deeply into quite a few topics. All of those will be posted on the website along with a thought exchange, because we do want to hear from the community. I think there's about 40 people on this call right now. So all of you who are at this meeting, plus anybody else in our community who views the presentation, reads the report, we'll want to hear from you, and we'll be asking you, what were your key takeaways and what else are you wondering about? So that will be an opportunity to give input in that way. That thought exchange will be open for about a week. After that, we'll have 2 meetings. These are meetings that will occur at Frederick School, so we're not going to do them online. And we'll have people register just so that we are prepared to know how many people are coming. But the concept is to further develop where we go from here. So the objective will be to prioritize our needs and build criteria to inform options. Because remember, tonight was not about options, right? Tonight was about the assessment that Wool did for us. So the first meeting is on Monday, April 17th at 6:30 at Frederick, and the second, May 1st at 6:30 on Frederick. I want to clarify, those are not repeat meetings. So the first meeting will occur. There'll be conversation about prioritizing needs. Wold will go and do their architect work and come back with some more recommendations for us to consider at the second meeting on May 1st. Vaughn, is there anything that you want to add about any of those opportunities for community input?
No, I think maybe what I would state is there's a lot of things we talked about tonight. And just as I mentioned, other districts we work with, I don't think I've met the district ever that said, we're going to tackle every single one of our needs no matter what, because it's just not the reality. The financing and what you can do at any given time is difficult, as well as maybe prioritization. You might see some items on a list and say, that would be nice to have, but that's really not where we are right now. So prioritizing starts to develop criteria, and that's what we base the options off of. We don't just like to develop options and go, do you like option A better than B? Do you like option B better than option C? They should be based on your priorities and what you want to do as a community. And so that's really what we're doing with these sessions.
Vaughn, I see that there's also another question that came earlier that I think I can address.
Perfect.
All right, so somebody's asked, it was mentioned that multilingual program and dual language program would be touched on more. Could you tell me more about that? So one of our strategic goals involves looking at the current programming that we have for multilingual students, which is either currently students who are Spanish bilingual, getting instruction in their home language, but also, and then having some instruction in English as well. And then students who have other linguistic backgrounds, not Spanish, going into a classroom for their English language arts with a multilingual teacher who can support their learning. However, one of the processes that we're studying, again, through our strategic plan, is what if we were to open what's called two-way dual language? When you have a two-way dual language, and I think, Vaughn, you connected on this a little bit earlier, you actually have students whose background is English speaking, along with students whose background is speaking with another language, most likely Spanish, and then instructing students in both languages in one classroom. So providing English and Spanish opportunities for students with both backgrounds in one classroom. So that's something that's being studied by the school district. I'll also mention here that earlier there was one slide that talked about world languages, and that is also one of the topics that we're studying through our strategic plan goals. The possibility of bringing world languages back into our curriculum for our upper grades. That's what I've got for you, Vaughn.
Okay.
Okay.
And I realize that this is now going into an hour and 20 minutes, and you may not have budgeted that much time. So I hope that as you have a chance to look at the information further, and you do have questions, that Thought Exchange is a great use for that, and that you're able to take a look and see from that standpoint, what were your key takeaways tonight, and what else are you wondering about? I know that we can really get down into the nitty gritty on things, but we're trying to give the high level overview right now and say, here's the areas that we would frame the discussion around and where you might start talking about priorities. So with that, I think that's what I have to present. And Lynn, I'll let you close it out if nothing else.
I will be happy to. Thank you so much for sticking with us, everyone. And anybody who's watching this at a later date on our website, we really appreciate your review of all of the hard work that Wold put into this assessment. We're really excited to be thinking about what our opportunities might be for the future. And with that, I wish everyone a great night. Bye, everyone.